Is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Sean Jones NBA Show. I'm recording this on Monday, February 2nd. By the time this gets out, you may not be hearing until February 3rd, but got a pretty packed episode for you today. We had NBA All-Star reserves announced yesterday, so I talked through those picks, where I agreed, where I did not. But the majority of today's pod is going to be on Giannis Antetokounmpo and his kind of trade demand, whatever we want to call it. Just the possibility of him being on his way out of Milwaukee. What teams are going to be involved? What teams should be involved? When should he be traded? When will he be traded? All of that stuff. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with a couple minor trades that went down over the past few days. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get right into it. Okay, so before I get to the Giannis trade stuff, they announced the All-Star reserves yesterday before the Sunday night game on NBC. So I just want to talk through the All-Star team a little bit and let you guys know what I agree with, what I don't agree with. I think for the most part, they did a pretty good job. There's really only one or two names that I had differing from what the coaches ended up coming up with for the reserves, and then the starters with the fan vote and the media and the players as well. In the Eastern Conference, the starters were Jalen Brunson, Tyrese Maxey, Cade Cunningham, Jaylen Brown, and Giannis. No notes on that. Those are the exact five that I had. The only real debate I had for a while was between Brunson and Mitchell, but just because the Cavs have struggled the way they have compared to expectations this year, and the stats are pretty similar between the two, I did give the nod to Brunson there. You know, Maxey's been the new face of the franchise for Philadelphia this year, and they've been in the playoff hunt all season long. Mostly because of what he's done, averaging 30-plus points per game this season. He's been spectacular after a little bit of a down shooting season last year. Cade is the engine that makes the Pistons go. They're the 1 seed in the East. That was a no-brainer just with the production that he's putting up. Jaylen Brown, been mentioned as a top 5 guy in the MVP race this season. You know, where Boston is in the standings compared to where myself and many people thought they would be, and just the jump in statistical production as well as efficiency, and for them to have the number 1 offense in the NBA right now and him being the main force behind that, he's a no-brainer starter this year as well. And then Giannis, you know, we're going to talk a lot about him today, but at the end of the day, he's still a no-brainer top 4 player in the NBA. The Bucks have not been good, but not because of him. He's still putting up ungodly numbers this season, and so he's just a kind of pencil him in to starter every year kind of guy. In terms of the reserves, they had Norman Powell, Donovan Mitchell, Scotty Barnes, Pascal Siakam, Jalen Johnson, Jalen Duren, and Karl Anthony Towns. I had this exact same reserves except for one swap. I had Franz Wagner in over Pascal Siakam just because the Pacers have struggled so much this season. I think Siakam's great. Anyone who listens to my podcast knows that I'm a big Siakam guy. I always tend to lean towards him and the type of player he is over maybe some more talented or flashy players. But the guy's just rock solid. I have no problem with him getting in, but the Pacers really have been really bad this year. They're bottom of the Eastern Conference with a 13-36 record. Of course, I don't think that any of that has to do with Siakam. They've been absolutely destroyed with injuries this season, so I'm not going to hold it too much against him. But I did feel like, you know, the Magic, even though they've underperformed, they've been in the playoff picture the whole season long. And I think Franz Wagner is probably having the best season among any Magic player. But the counter to that is that, you know, he's only played 26 games. He's been injured. He still is currently injured. So if you didn't feel like he hit the game threshold, then I think Siakam is a very fine person to put him in that spot. And I'm not going to lose sleep over that. In terms of the rest of the reserves here, Norman Powell, I thought the Heat definitely deserved a representative just because they have been a top 8 team all season long. And I agree with them picking Norman Powell over Bam, for example. I think Bam is a better player, obviously much more accomplished. I would rather have Bam on my team. But I think just for the seasons that these guys are having, I think Norman Powell has been so important to what they've been doing. They're not a great offensive team, but he has kind of kept them afloat to at least close to league average, even though they don't have a lot of firepower on that end, especially with Tyler Hero being hurt to start the season. But, you know, last year there were whispers of him being in the All-Star discussion. I kind of poo-pooed that just because of how stacked the West is. But in the Eastern Conference, where there's All-Star spots to be had, I thought Norman Powell was certainly deserving, averaging career high in points and maintaining the same high level efficiency as throughout his career. So congrats to Norm. Very well deserved this year in the All-Star game. Donovan Mitchell, no-brainer. Not much to say about him. I mean, he was, like I mentioned, could have been a starter, but obviously the first guy in the reserves, if we're going to name somebody as sort of the guy who just missed the cut there. He's having another great year, and really one of the only big bright spots for Cleveland this season is his just continued excellence. Scotty Barnes, I thought he was an absolute lock to make this team, a no-brainer in my book. I know that some people might have preferred Brandon Ingram. He's the quote-unquote first option, the quote-unquote leading scorer of the team, etc. But the impact Barnes has had on this team goes well beyond just scoring. He has been spectacular defensively this season. He is really the engine of that offense. They run everything through him. He's a point forward. He's setting other guys up. And it's not like he's a bad scorer himself, averaging around 20 points per game anyway. So to me, he's such a Swiss Army knife player, a great two-way guy. I've been high on Barnes even through some of his struggles over the past few years. And so to me, he was a no-brainer pick for me. Jalen Johnson, same thing. Absolute no-brainer this season. I mean, the guy's averaging close to, 24, 10, and 8, not that far off from a triple-double on a team that lacks playmaking, that lacks ball handling, that lacks offensive initiation, especially with Trae Young no longer on the team. Johnson has had to step in and be the guy on that team, and he has produced at a very, very high level. And despite not being a great defensive team and not having a lot of help on the offensive end, they've still hovered around that 500 range in the playoff, or at least the play-in mix, even without Trae Young, obviously off the team now, but not playing that much even when he was on the team. So Jalen Johnson, absolute no-brainer to make it for this team, and I'm sure he's going to make many more considering he's still 23, 24 years old. Jalen Durham, I thought he deserved it as well, mostly just because of how good the Pistons have been. The East has been so inconsistent, so mediocre across the board. I mean, with all the struggles the Knicks have had that people have talked about, they're still in the 2 seed, and a lot of that has to do just with the inconsistencies across other teams in the conference alongside them. But the Pistons have been the one constant. They have been rock solid all year long, a very good defensive team. Jalen Duren's been a huge part of that. He's emerged as sort of that second option around Cade that they've needed. Of course, he's not doing a lot of shot creation himself, but he's just been a dominant physical force down low on both ends. We know how good of a rebounder he can be as well. Just an athletic freak. So, I thought he earned it just based on the success the Pistons have had, and it felt right for them to get 2 All-Stars this year. Then the last pick was Cat. I would have been okay if Cat missed, to be honest, just because his stats are down across the board. The Knicks have been really inconsistent. A lot of these sort of shortcomings of the Knicks have been pawned on to Cat and his inefficiencies, and especially as of late, he hasn't seemed super engaged really on either end of the court. But at the end of the day, it's a weak conference. The Knicks are the 2 seed, so it's fair for them to get 2 All-Stars in this scenario, and he is still one of the best 12 players in the Eastern Conference without a doubt. So kind of just went with pedigree on that one, as well as just the lack of a lot of other options. I mean, other guys to be considered. Josh Giddey, I thought, was on track to maybe make it, but he just has missed too much time, hasn't played enough games. I know a lot of people were in on Michael Porter Jr. to make it, but to me, I mean, the Nets are 13-35. I'm not really in the business of rewarding teams that are that bad. I know he's been great statistically, maintained his regular efficiency that he had in Denver with a elevated role in Brooklyn. But I can't sit here and overly defend a guy that's on a team that's, they've lost by 50 plus multiple times over the last couple of weeks. Like, they're a mess. And of course it's not all on him, but I don't feel great about putting a guy with that kind of record in the All-Star game, especially a guy like him. Compared to Siakam, I know you could argue the same, but he's a proven All-Star. He's done it in the past. We know he's of that caliber. So I get defaulting to the pedigree over a guy like Porter, who's, having a one-off really great year, but how, true are those numbers when it's not leading to wins? Whereas with Siakam, we've seen him put up the same numbers and have an impact on winning. So I will defer to the tiebreaker there. I already kind of talked about Ingram. I don't think the Raptors really were good enough to get 2 All-Stars given the rest of the field here. Same with Bam Adebayo and the Heat. The last name, Joel Embiid, at least worth noting. He's come on really strong recently, looked a lot more like his old self. Still not quite to that level, but certainly been playing at a high enough level to be considered for the All-Star team, at least as of late. And so there's going to be an injury replacement for Giannis, obviously. Wouldn't be surprised if Embiid got into that slot, especially with the new format this year with the U.S. versus World. Embiid obviously could represent World in that case as well. So We'll see. Don't have a problem with Embiid missing just because he was really inconsistent to start the season and, missed a lot of time to begin the year, but wouldn't be surprised if he got in as a replacement. Two guys I want to note that I did not have on here and I did not even consider because of the years they're having are Evan Mobley and Paolo Banchero. Good players. Historically, both made all-star teams in the past. Mobley was an all-NBA guy last year, but both guys have stagnated. Both guys have, in some ways, almost regressed. Both guys' teams have been underperforming, and I just didn't think that they were the best player on their team this year, and I didn't think their teams deserved two all-stars. So I just wanted to call out that, bigger names, but to me, they were not even in consideration. Everybody I previously mentioned as a sort of a snub, I would have had ahead of those guys. Moving to the West, where I had a little bit more dissent with the picks, but still across the board, for the most part, I think they got it right. The starters in the West were Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Luka Doncic, Stephen Curry, Victor Wembanyama, and Nikola Jokic. I mostly agree with these. The only thing I probably would have changed here was having Steph as a reserve and have Ant actually starting. If you just look at the seasons these guys are having, I mean, Ant's averaging more points, more rebounds, more steals, more blocks, better field goal percentage, better three-point percentage. The advanced stats are very, very close between the two, and his team's better. And you could say, oh, well, Steph has less help, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's not like Ant has a ton of help in that backcourt. It's been talked about as one of the biggest weaknesses across any of the at least potential contenders is the Timberwolves and how they don't have ball handling, they don't have shot creation, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot on Ant's plate right now, just like there's a lot on Steph's plate. But I just think Anthony Edwards has been better. I think he's having a better season. And at this point in Steph's career, I think Anthony Edwards just is a better player and more impactful, especially as a two-way guy. So I would have had Ant as a starter. Obviously, Steph still would have made the team for me, but I would have had him off the bench. Rest of the guys here, no brainer. Jokic and SGA are the clear-cut top two guys in the league right now, the two front runners for MVP. There's not really much to say about those guys. I think they're on the two best teams in the NBA as well. Luka, the Lakers have been inconsistent, but they've been better than most people have been giving them credit for in terms of actually winning games. He has been sort of the constant. LeBron was injured to start the year, and then Reeves has been out for most of the second half of this season to this point. And so Luka has been the guy. He's putting up his normal ridiculous numbers, well over 30 points, close to triple-double, and the number one reason the Lakers are in the position they're in. So to me, obviously, he's another one of those guys like Giannis, just kind of pencil him in as a starter every year. And then Wemby, with the Spurs, where they are in the standings right now, I know he's missed some time as well and even had some times coming off the bench on minutes restrictions, et cetera. But to me, he has kind of solidified himself as at least in the running for that top 5 range in the NBA this season. We know the kind of impact he has on the defensive end. He's been much more efficient and a better offensive player this season as well, taking less jump shots, more shots at the basket. And so to me, especially given the success the Spurs have had, he was a no-brainer starter as well and is probably going to continue to be one over the next, half decade to full decade of his career. Moving to the reserves where they had Ant, which I mentioned, I would have had him starting over Steph, Jamal Murray, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, Denny Avdia, LeBron James, and Chet Holmgren. So just going through the list here, Jamal Murray is having by far the best season of his career. It's been very talked about. People are always like, oh, how is Jamal Murray never made an all-star team? People say because of his postseason performances. Well, to me, it's very obvious why he never made an all-star team, because he hasn't played like an all-star in the regular season. This year he's posting career highs, 26 points per game, 7.5 assists, 4.4 rebounds. Those are all career highs. He's shooting career high 44% from three, 49% from the field, like the most production he's ever had, the best efficiency he's ever had. And with Jokic being out, he has proven to be a guy that can actually carry this team a little bit without Jokic, which has been the biggest issue for the Nuggets in this era of basketball for Denver. And so what the team has done in Jokic's absence has just amplified the stats that Murray has had and the impact that he's had. So this is the first year where I genuinely believe that he deserved to be an all-star. So I was always kind of sick of people talking about that because he just hadn't been consistent enough in a stacked West to justify that slot. But this year, he certainly has backed it up and is very deserving. Devin Booker, he's having kind of a weird year because his stats are down across the board. The scoring volume is down. His three-point shooting has fallen off a cliff. He's, just above 30% after, he's been kind of a weirdly overrated shooter throughout his career. He's only at around 35% for his career, even though he's pretty well regarded as a really good shooter. And he's shown he can make those shots. But for whatever reason, the shot is not falling this season. And so the efficiency's taking a little bit of a hit, and the scoring is a little bit down. The assists are a little bit down from where they've been over a couple of the past few seasons. But look, the Suns have wildly exceeded any expectations that anybody had for this team. They have been in the thick of the playoff race all season long. I mean, they are one game out of the 5 seed, only 3 games out of the 3 seed. Like, that's just not something that anyone would have thought was possible for this team. So to me, they absolutely had to have a representative, just because they're in that little bunch of them, the Lakers, the Wolves, and the Rockets. Like, one of those teams goes on a 2-game losing streak or 2-game win streak, and suddenly you go from 7th to 4th and vice versa. And the Suns are in that group right now. Whether they're that caliber of team come playoff time, that's a different discussion. But to this point, Phoenix just deserved a representative. And of course, the obvious choice was going to be Booker. I also think his impact goes well beyond just the numbers. You know, he is one of the most blitzed players in the NBA this season. And it makes sense because they don't have a lot of other threats on the offensive end, at least they can create for themselves. And so his gravity, his willingness to not be the ball dominant guy, but to do whatever the team needs him to do on the offensive end, I think his impact is greatly felt for this team, and we can see in his absence they've been struggling a little bit more. So to me, Booker was an obvious fit for this as well. Kevin Durant, you know, he's Kevin Durant. He's on a team that's a top 4 seed in the West. He's the number 1 option, probably best player on the team. So not much to say. You know, he's still shooting crazy efficiency like he has throughout all of his career. He's still a 25-plus point per game scorer. I don't think anyone was arguing about that one. Denny Avdia, to me, he had to be on as well. Portland's obviously not spectacular. You know, they're 23 and 27. They've been in the play-in really for most of the season, though. But what he's been doing, like the context of this team where Scoot hasn't played a single game yet. Drew Holiday's missed the majority of the season. Dame obviously is out for the season. Like, they don't have any guards. He's been basically having to play point guard for this team, even though he's a 6'9" forward. And he's taken it in stride. You know, he's one of the best players in the league at getting to the line. His numbers have taken a huge leap up into the 26, 7, and 7 range. I don't think anybody thought he was going to ever be at that level. Like, even the biggest Avdia believers, even though I've been a fan of Denny, but I did not see this sort of development coming from him. And so I think he just deserves to get rewarded because, look, is Portland spectacular this season? No. But he is like everything for them offensively. And if he wasn't having this kind of season, if he was even just having the kind of year he had last year, I don't even think Portland would be sniffing the play-in right now because they just wouldn't have enough offensively. Then Chet Holmgren, I was on the fence about him. You know, there was other guys I would have considered, but I think ultimately I'm fine with him getting in, and he was one of my picks just because he's been so good defensively for Oklahoma City. He's arguably the favorite for Defensive Player of the Year right now. And look, the Thunder have just been the clear-cut best team all year long. They, even with their, you know, kind of recent struggles, they're still 5.5 games up on the 1 seed in the West. They're 39 and 11. And Chet has been the clear-cut number 2 guy in this team because J-Dub has just barely played this season. And so Holmgren's been the number 2 option on offense for a dominant team, the defensive anchor. And so it just made sense for them to get 2 all-stars given where they are. And I think that he's taken enough of a leap on the offensive end to justify to go along with his defensive prowess. And then the last guy here, I want to have a little bit of a discussion about. LeBron James was selected with the final pick in the reserves for the West All-Stars. And this is where I actually will disagree pretty strongly. And anyone who knows me knows I am a LeBron stan, a Bron sexual, as they say, whatever you want to call it. I love LeBron James. He is, to me, the GOAT, one of my favorite, if not my favorite player all time. My cat is literally named LeBron because I like LeBron so much. But he just did not deserve to make the All-Star game based on merit this season. And I think Kawhi Leonard really got robbed this year because he's arguably been one of the 5 best players in the entire league this season. If you just look at the stats compared to LeBron, especially where he's, you know, almost 6 more points per game, more rebounds. He leads the league in steal. He's nearly 50, 40, 90. And the advanced stats say he's having a phenomenal season. The eye test says he's having a phenomenal season. And honestly, the type of year he's having is up there with any year that he's had. He's been that good offensively, and he still is a well above average defensive player as well, even if he's not at his Defensive Player of the Year form. And I will say this, if you'd asked me 2-3 weeks ago, I actually would not have had Kawhi Leonard on the team because the Clippers started the year 6-21. And the same argument I made for some of the guys in the East, like I just can't in good faith put a guy on a team that's losing that much in the All-Star team, especially in the West where it is just so difficult to make these calls. But with the play that they've had recently, and with them now, sitting 23-25, they're only 3 games back of the Warriors. Like they've made up enough ground to me where it made sense to put Leonard in because he's just been that good. And even though they're still below 500, they have a really good shot to make the playoffs still, especially with Jimmy Butler going down and still probably some question marks about how legitimate Phoenix is come actual postseason time in like a play-in setting. It wouldn't shock me at all if the Clippers somehow managed to get into that number 7 seed and are at least much closer to what we thought they'd be preseason than what they showed at the beginning of the year. So to me, Kawhi Leonard is maybe having one of the best seasons to not make an All-Star team I've ever seen. And LeBron, it felt like more of a legacy pick, which I'll say this. I am totally okay with the NBA saying we're going to do an honorary All-Star selection for LeBron James. They have done it before for worse players. They did it for Kobe. They did it for Wade. They did it for Dirk. Of course, all those guys were in their last season, but it still remains a little unclear if this is going to be LeBron's last year. Consider me skeptical. I think he'll do one more year next year, and it'll be his farewell tour. But he hasn't ruled it out, at least publicly. So I think that would have been totally okay to make him an honorary All-Star just because of the legacy and the history. And I mean, he's one of the top 2 best players in NBA history, regardless of what you think between him and Jordan. Like, he is a legend of the game in its purest definition. And so the All-Star game is a better product when he's there. So I totally get that. But I feel like it just should not have come at the expense of somebody else. I would have rather Kawhi made it and then maybe they just put LeBron in as an honorary member. Maybe he didn't want to do that because it would have felt like a participation trophy. I don't know what went on behind the scenes. But I do not think he deserves to be there based off merit, but I understand why they did it. It just sucks for Kawhi that he had to be sort of the odd man out. But hey, maybe this is them trying to also send a message to him with all the stuff that was happening with the aspiration nonsense in the offseason, which they still have not resolved. So for snubs in the West, I thought Austin Reeves had a good chance to make it. Obviously, the Lakers were not going to get 3 All-Stars based on where they are in the standings. You really only get 3 when you're having like a best team in the league type season. But he also just missed too many games as of recently, so I didn't think he had much of a chance after that. James Harden is having a really good statistical season. But again, the Clippers are not good enough to justify 2 guys getting in. So if one Clipper was going to get in, it was going to be Kawhi. So, Harden just I didn't think he had much of a case because of that. Dylan Brooks, I think, at least deserves a mention for the Suns because he's having a Draymond Green-esque, Rudy Gobert-esque type impact in terms of like guys that are predominantly defensive players or role players that have gotten in just because of the impact they've had. But he's also averaging career high in points, over 20 a game, and has been the number 2 option for a team that's been in the playoffs all season long. And with Booker out, has been the number 1 option and has actually done pretty well. So I don't think Brooks should have necessarily made it over some of these other guys that I'm mentioning as snubs, but he's at least worth mentioning because of the season he's had. Lauri Markkanen, the Jazz have just not been good enough. And then Alperen Şengün, I think, was the other guy who had a very legitimate case for being snubbed. He hasn't played as well recently. He also did miss some time, but he's still like a 20-10-6 guy on a legitimately good playoff team that's probably going to be a top 4 seed. Maybe you didn't want to put 2 Rockets in there because they have been a little disappointing as of late in terms of just their offensive inconsistencies and their late game execution, etc. But I thought Şengün was having a good enough year to at least make it. And to me, him and Kawhi were the 2 biggest snubs here. I went back and forth. I think if you asked me 2-3 weeks ago, I would have had Şengün in and Kawhi out because of the record I mentioned, and then LeBron also out, obviously. But, overall, I think the All-Star teams were pretty good. I only had a couple qualms here and there about who I would have had in. But nobody that got in, do I think it was egregious or anything like that? LeBron's probably the closest to that. But, he obviously gets a little leeway just because of who he is and what he's done. Okay, so I'm going to shift over to talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo and his very passive-aggressive trade demand, where he has not technically asked for a trade, according to Shams and or the Bucks and or Giannis and his representatives, but has made it known to the front office that it could be in the best interest for both parties to part ways. So whatever that means, but I think it's a little annoying the way that Giannis has handled this whole situation, because it seems like he's trying to do everything in his power to not be the quote unquote bad guy here. He doesn't want to ask out. He doesn't want to be a villain in Milwaukee, et cetera, et cetera. But Giannis, just ask for the trade. I promise you, nobody in Milwaukee is going to hold anything against you. You are a two-time MVP. You are a defensive player of the year. You are the franchise's all-time leader in games, minutes, field goals made, field goal percentage, points, assists, rebounds, blocks, triple doubles, and most importantly, you are a finals MVP, an NBA champion, and you brought a title to a town that had not had one in over 50 years. You are the greatest Buck to ever play. You could argue Kareem was a better player all time, and I would argue that as well. But the impact Giannis has had on this franchise and this team is far beyond what Kareem did, because he's been here for 12, 13 years to this point, and he has made the Bucks relevant. Milwaukee was not a relevant team, a relevant franchise, a relevant city in the NBA for decades, since Kareem, honestly. And, they had some one-off decent seasons throughout there, but Giannis made them a mainstay, a regular contender, a primetime team that played on Christmas Day every year, that was getting the ABC showcase slot on Sundays, that was getting the TNT Thursday night slots. Like, this was a team that everybody would pencil in as one of the marquee teams to watch, and it is for no reason other than Giannis. And so he's given this franchise everything. He's giving this city everything. Bucks fans are not going to be mad if you just ask for the trade. And to be honest, it is in the best interest of the team and the franchise, in my honest opinion, that they trade him also. I think it is best for both parties to just move on, because it's already gotten pretty ugly this season with the on-court product, and I think it's only going to get worse. And the longer they wait, the more these injuries pile up for Giannis. The value's not getting any higher, so they should just sell now while they can. And Giannis should be okay with that, because he will not win anything else the rest of his career if he stays in Milwaukee. He can, rack up the stats, rack up the All-Stars, the All-NBAs, but he's not going to win another MVP there because the team's not going to be good enough, and he's not going to win anything in the playoffs because they just don't have the assets or the requisite talent around him to compete at a high level right now. And it's okay. This team went for it. They went all in by trading for Drew Holiday, and it worked out. They took other swings that didn't work out. They traded for Dame, which I still will be on record defending that trade. I would have made that trade. I think it was a trade that makes sense based on where they were, and it didn't work out. It just didn't work out, and that's okay. It doesn't make it some huge mistake, because I don't think they were going to win anything even if they didn't make that deal, for example. But they swung out with the Kuzma trade. They essentially swung out with this Miles Turner swing, which is kind of a absolute swing for the fence that I don't think many people thought was some massive impact move anyway. But the point is, they've been willing to invest in him, but it's just the end of the road. They don't have any more moves left. They've got basically one tradable first-round pick that, what's that going to get them? Zach LaVine? He's not changing the destiny of this team, and I don't know if there's any other talented guy out there. John Morant? Because, I don't particularly like that fit at all. He's another ball-dominant guard that didn't really work with Dame, but except he can't shoot, and Giannis can't shoot. So I just don't know what the move is. It makes sense for both parties to move on. So Giannis, I just want to say, just ask for the trade. Just be formal about it. It is okay. But regardless of the formality of the trade request, it is essentially a trade request. So I will talk through what this trade request means for the Bucks. And I will first start off by saying, I think that a deal in the offseason makes significantly more sense than it does at the deadline. We're only a couple of days away from the deadline, but there are many reasons why I don't think he will get traded at the deadline. And two, I don't think it's in the best interest of basically anybody involved to trade him at the deadline when you can do it in the offseason. For one, there are multiple teams that are, real players in the sweepstakes that will have additional assets come the offseason. The Knicks can trade one extra first-round pick in the offseason. The Wolves can trade an additional first in the offseason. The Lakers, I don't know how much they can get into this, but they have an additional first they can trade. Other wild card teams like the Blazers can trade up to 2 additional first round picks. So there's just going to be more assets on the table. And if you're the Bucks, why would you not just want to milk that out of them? Right now, these teams are like, I'm handcuffed. I only have 2 picks to trade right now. And it's hard to argue with that. That it's true. They literally cannot offer more. So waiting till the offseason just makes more sense because those teams will have more assets to trade, so you can get more out of them. At the very least, it's a negotiation tactic to whether you get those picks or not, but at least be able to get maybe more than you would now. Another reason, there are a number of players on teams that could potentially be in this that are kind of untradeable right now. If you are familiar with the poison pill rule, it is when guys sign extensions and they are in the last season of the previous contract before that contract kicks in. And so basically how it works is we'll take a guy like Dyson Daniels, for example, who is a player who's on a poison pill contract. He's making, $6-7 million right now, but he's set to make, around 25 next year. And so the way it works is that if you trade for Dyson Daniels, it only counts as the 7 million outgoing for the Hawks, but it counts as the 25 million coming in for you, which makes salary matching virtually impossible. So these guys are basically untradeable, but there's a list of guys that all could theoretically, be in play here. Dyson Daniels being one, like I mentioned, Shaedon Sharpe for Portland, Jabari Smith for Houston. Maybe they go bigger fish hunting and things go a little crazy. Paolo Banchero, Chet Holmgren. I'm not saying these guys would be in a deal. I'm just saying that you get more picks on the table and a greater pool of players that you could potentially get out of these teams. Whereas right now, if they go to Atlanta, you can't even ask for Dyson Daniels, for example, because it's just not going to work money-wise. So that's something to consider as well. And of course, the other thing that I think is very relevant here is there's a lot of teams right now who probably look at their roster and their season and they're like, I like what we've got right now. We've got a good thing going. We don't want to uproot the roster because that's probably what it's going to take to get him, shake things up. How often do these midseason trades really translate to anything come postseason time? I've talked about this in the past. It's pretty rare. It's usually the year after when they do finally win something, if they end up winning something. And so by trading for him, you might essentially be guaranteeing that this isn't going to be your year. And so if you're a team like the Thunder or the Spurs or the Rockets or the Cavs, do you really want to do that and just basically throw away a year of contention when you could see what you have in the postseason this year and readdress it in the offseason? So OKC's probably not interested, but what if they lose second round this year? What if the bracket falls a certain way and San Antonio plays them tough, knocks them out? Or what if they lose in the conference finals to Denver? They might be more willing to consider something like this because right now they're riding high. They're like, we're the champs. Why wouldn't we think we can win it again this year? But when you actually have that loss again the next year, it can change that mindset a little bit. What happens if the Spurs lose in the first round and they realize, oh man, we want to see what we have, but we saw some clear weaknesses here. Let's go get Giannis. Or the Rockets, for example. What if they lose first round? Back-to-back years losing first round. They said last year they didn't want to add anybody big. They lose first round. That, calculus changed a little bit. They go out and get Kevin Durant. They didn't have to give up a ton, but, obviously Dylan Brooks is not nothing. They give up a top 10 pick. Jalen Green hasn't played much this year, but was still a big part of the team last year. And so, there are a lot of scenarios where teams that think they're, going to go far in the playoffs that just won't go far in the playoffs. It happens every single year. What happens if the Cavs flame out again? What happens if the Hornets sneak into the playoffs and then they're suddenly like, oh man, we're not as far away as we thought. Let's make a big move. What if a team like the Hawks, who have the better of the Pelicans or Bucks pick this season, I'm sure they want to see what that lottery ends up turning out. And if they end up with the number 1 or number 2 pick, they're probably going to just slow play this thing and roll with the young roster. What if that pick falls to 5th or 6th overall? Suddenly they're like, oh man, we were hoping for a top 3 guy. Maybe they're more willing to move that pick, and that becomes a valuable asset that Milwaukee might want. So there's a lot of teams that I think seeing how the season plays out could definitely change the calculus and the dynamic of whether they want to get involved in this thing. So that's why, to me, if you're Milwaukee, you're going to have more suitors, more players that you can acquire, more picks on the table. I don't really understand why they would trade him at the deadline. I think the counter to it would be like, well, they want to bottom out. They want to tank. So get rid of him as soon as you can so that you can do that. But he's injured right now. He's out 4 to 6 weeks. So there's a real scenario where they kind of just shut him down and he doesn't play again the rest of the season. And if that's the case, like they're already plummeting down the standings right now, and they're going to be bad enough where they can get themselves in a position to have a really good pick. And it's a unique position because they don't own the full rights to their pick because Atlanta has the right to swap with the New Orleans slot. But because New Orleans is so bad, they've been a bottom two team all year standings wise. The Bucks could still end up with a really good pick. The Pelicans get the number one pick that goes to Atlanta, then the Bucks could get as high as the number two pick in the draft. So there's real incentive for them to bottom out. But again, because he's hurt, that kind of gets rid of that issue for you where now you can just kind of ride what the team's on and maybe bring it back at the end just so we can get a couple more games in and do like a final send-off or hurrah. Because I think that would be nice too if his last game that he played was like a game he got injured in. That would kind of suck. But I just think the injury makes that part of it a little easier. So to me, if I'm the Bucks, I'm not trading him until the offseason. I would trade him in the offseason, don't get me wrong. But I would wait until then just because of all these factors. But let's just go through a lot of the teams that have been rumored. I'm not going to go through every single team in the league, but I want to cover a good chunk because I think that there's a lot of different teams that could get into play here depending on when this deal actually goes down. So I broken the teams up into a few different categories. There's kind of the four that have been mentioned, the Warriors, the Heat, the Knicks, and the Wolves. They're kind of in two separate categories for me. I would say that the in-season favorites are the Warriors and the Heat because I think that their offers are the most straightforward right now if we operate under the assumption that they do want to move them before the deadline. And then we've got the complicated hopefuls between the Knicks and the Wolves who seems like both of them would like to add him, but it is very complicated and would take, a 3, 4, maybe even 5 team trade to pull that off and get him just based on the fact that they don't have a lot of draft equity to trade right now. And they probably would have to move some of their core pieces in order to get extra draft capital to send to Milwaukee because, look, the Bucks probably don't want Mikal Bridges. The Bucks probably don't want Julius Randle because those guys are proven commodities. We know what they are. They're not going to help the Bucks win enough games to be relevant now, but they're also not going to be part of their future down the line. And so I think they're going to want younger assets, players with all-star upside and picks. At least that's what I would want. Not saying I wouldn't trade for a proven commodity, but I would want someone a little younger than those guys. So starting out with the two teams that I think that are the most likely, if there were to be an in-season deal, I think the Warriors to me would make the most sense. And a deal might look like something with, Giannis and Kuzma going to the Warriors, and then the Bucks would get back probably Jimmy Butler's contract, which would be expiring going into next year, or Draymond Green. There was some rumblings that would actually be the move. Whatever, one of those guys has to go out in the deal, and then Kuminga would be a part of it. Couple other fillers. Maybe they put Pods in there. Maybe they put Moody, whatever it ends up being. They can trade up to 3 first-round picks right now and then 3 swaps. And one of the reasons why I think the Warriors offer is maybe one of the most desirable is because I think those picks could be really valuable. That 2032 Warriors pick, Steph will be long gone and retired. Draymond will be long gone and retired. Even Giannis by then. Maybe he's not retired, but he'd be on his last legs. He's already had injury history. He's a bigger guy that relies on physicality. So I don't know how well his game's going to age. So that pick, if you get that fully unprotected, that's one of the most valuable assets that the Bucks probably could get in any of these deals. Would you want more than 3 picks? Ideally, yes. Are you super pumped to get an injured 36-year-old Jimmy Butler that probably doesn't want to be in Milwaukee? Probably not. To me, that's not being talked about enough. That's sort of a negative asset to me if you're a team like the Bucks. Like, you're taking this massive $55 million salary that is probably not going to play for your team ever. And, obviously next year it's an expiring, so maybe there's some more value there. But for Milwaukee, I think this makes the most sense among all of the deals in season. But again, I still think you could get more if you wait till the offseason. From the Warriors' perspective here, would I do this deal? Probably. But the thing where I'm at with the Warriors is they're not good enough right now. They're not going to contend at all with the current construction, especially with Jimmy out. And so they have 2 paths they can go down. And I think they have to pick one. If they ride this middle and just kind of sit here, it makes the least sense to me. So to me, you either go all in, just get Giannis. Giannis and Steph is as dynamic a duo as we'd have in the league. I think they would complement each other well. I think Draymond and Giannis would be a deadly, deadly defensive combo. Would they be thin on the wing? Absolutely. They'd have a lot of guards and then some bigger forwards like Draymond and Giannis, but not a lot of those, like a true small forward, for example. They'd be playing guys down position, or you might have to rely on a guy like Kuzma coming back to play actual minutes for them, which I don't think anybody would really prefer. But Steph and Giannis, you could argue that you've got a shot in any series at that point. And maybe they're good enough defensively where Steph and Giannis is enough on offense to carry them through. And do I think that team would contend for a championship? I think probably not. I still think that they just would be a little too thin and the roster is a little bit too imbalanced. But look, they'd be a lot better off than they are right now. Giannis in the Jimmy spot is obviously an upgrade, and they, came into the year as a team that people thought could make some noise. So who knows from that point. But if they don't trade for Giannis, to me, they have to go the other path and trade Steph and, trade Draymond, get what you can for those guys. I do not think they're going to do that. I don't think it's ever going to happen. But if you're the Warriors, I think you have to go all in or you have to blow it up. And I fear that they're going to ride this middle and it's not going to get them very far. So I'll say this. I think the Warriors are the likeliest team if it happens before the deadline. But I think if they do not pull it off before the deadline, then they become a lot less likely of a team to get Giannis, because I think there's going to be better offers. There's going to be teams more well-positioned. And I think from Giannis's perspective, there's going to be better options in terms of actually trying to win a championship. The next other team that I think has the best shot in season is the Heat. And it could look something like Giannis and Kuzma going to Miami for Tyler Hero, Khalil Ware, Jaime Jaquez, and they can trade up to 2 first-round picks. But they could open up another pick if Charlotte agrees to remove some protections. I don't know why Charlotte would necessarily do that, so that could be tougher. But they also could ship out Wiggins to a third team, maybe get a first back for him. Again, I don't know what his market looks like, but there's definitely a way where Miami could work their way into having 3 first-round picks along with Hero, with Ware, which to me, that's a pretty decent offer. I mean, I think we have to recalibrate a little bit in terms of like what these kind of guys go for these days. I think 5 years ago, Giannis was going for 4 first-round picks, all the swaps, all the young players, all that. I still think in the offseason it could be something closer to that, but in the where we are in terms of just mid-season and the inflexibility a lot of these teams have in terms of not having the full draft cupboard to unload, not having the financial flexibility to trade certain guys, and some teams in the second increment, et cetera. If they're going to trade Giannis in the season, they're just going to probably get a little bit less. And so is 3 picks plus Hero plus Ware plus Jaquez like what they probably envisioned? Probably not, but it's not awful when you consider the circumstances, because Hero did make the All-Star team last year. He still is a 25 point per game scorer, or at least in the 20-25 range when he's at his best, and he's going to be relatively marketable, I guess. And they'll have a guy that can put up numbers for them. I really like Khalil Ware, though. I think Miami's like mismanaging that whole situation. I think he's got potential to be like a 18 and 12 guy with a block and a half that making threes. Like, he's so talented. He can shoot from outside. He's a really good shot blocker and elite rebounder, but they don't even play in 20 minutes a game. And so I get it to an extent because him and Bam has just been kind of a clunky fit. But in terms of like blue chip prospects, I think Ware's probably one of the better ones that Milwaukee could get. And so I totally understand why that would be desirable for them. Jaime Jaquez is in the 6th man of the year conversation. He's never going to be a star, but obviously a pretty good player nonetheless. And if you can get that extra first pick for Wiggins, maybe it's, to the Lakers for a first and Dalton Connect and Rui Hachimura or something like that, just some salary fillers. I know Connect kind of asked for a trade request, which I don't know if they're going to fulfill that. But the point is, the Miami offer's okay. Both Golden State and Miami have decent offers. They're kind of somewhat similar packages, but a little different, where I think Miami's probably giving a little better player package. I think that Golden State has more desirable picks, so it really just kind of depends on what Milwaukee's going for. Giannis in Miami, I don't love the fit just because I think him and Bam, I mean, I think that they'd be spectacular defensively with those two, but offensively, it feels a little clunky to me. Neither of them are particularly good shooters. I know Bam has improved there, but I still prefer him not shooting a million jump shots a game, especially in the mid range. And then with Hero gone, it's like Norman Powell's your only semi reliable perimeter offensive threat, especially if you're then sending Wiggins out. Then you're thin at the forward spot. Maybe you're going to have to play guys like Jovic and Pele Larson more minutes there, who are young, unproven, definitely not sure things. And then at the guard spot, I mean, it's Davion Mitchell as really the only ball handler that you trust in that backcourt. So, it's not a great team, especially offensively. I think they would be devastating defensively, though. And I think, if anyone's going to be able to make it work, it would be Eric Spoelstra. And I'll say this, the East is really weak. So I couldn't totally rule them out in terms of being a contender to at least make the finals. Like Golden State, I think just the competition is so much tougher that to go win 3 rounds is going to be really hard, especially in season when they've got huge holes on other parts of the roster. With Miami, I think they could be good enough defensively and makeshift enough offensively between Giannis and Norman Powell and Bam that maybe they could make a run to the finals, just because I don't really trust anybody in the East right now. But in terms of winning a championship, I still think they would definitely need to add another piece in that backcourt, on the wing, whatever it might be, just another reliable scorer, another reliable ball handler, and just another offensive threat, because I don't know if they'd have enough on that end. Getting to the 2 teams that I mentioned are sort of, complicated hopefuls for Giannis. Minnesota's name has been mentioned quite a bit, and I just want to reiterate how difficult it will be for them to acquire him, especially midseason, because they are right up against the second apron. They're a first apron team, which means they can't take back any more money than they're giving out. But also, they just don't have picks to trade right now. They literally have 0 tradable first-round picks at the moment. They do have 3 swaps, but again, we are talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo. And I'll say the same thing with this for the Knicks. Giannis is not going for 1 first-round pick. I'm sorry. There's just no scenario. I don't care how badly he wants to go to the Knicks. I don't care if he wants to force his way to Minnesota. The Bucks front office cannot in their right mind accept any deal where they're getting 1 first-round pick. The Wolves have 0, as I mentioned, that they can trade right now. And so this becomes very complicated if they want to pull this off. They basically have to turn 2 out of 3 of, Gobert, McDaniels, or Randall into picks that they can then send to Milwaukee from that third team. But then again, if you're the Bucks, I don't know if just picks are getting the job done. So I'd want some sort of players too. So the best idea I could come up for this is, I think Gobert maybe goes for around 2 first-round picks, 1 to 2. McDaniels could go for 2 to 3. Randall for 1 to 2. I think McDaniels probably gets the most just because he's younger in his contract and, more of a cleaner fit for most teams. So the best idea I could come up with for a trade here is basically maybe Atlanta and the Hawks would be interested in Jaden McDaniels. I do think he would be a really nice fit next to Jalen Johnson in the front court. And they'd be, could be really, really good defensively with him and Dyson Daniels, whatever. But Reese Shea and 2 firsts plus fillers to Minnesota for McDaniels, which would obviously get repurposed. Then if you're in Milwaukee, you're getting Reese Shea. I don't know how much they believe in him. I'm not a huge believer, but he was number 1 overall pick just a couple of years ago. They're getting 2 first-round picks. Again, I don't know if those would be the Bucks' first-round picks because Atlanta does have a couple of those, but at least you're getting quantity of picks there. Then maybe you send Gobert to a team like the Hornets, which, by the way, I think that would be a tremendous fit. I would absolutely love, love, love that for Charlotte because they are been really fun offensively this year. They could really use some defensive help, and they're pretty thin at the center spot. And so Gobert sliding in next to those guys, I really do like that fit there. So maybe they send 2 firsts, Colin Sexton, some other fillers to Minnesota. And so there, maybe you've got 4 firsts that you can send to Milwaukee along with Reese Shea, contract fillers, expirings, some combination of Yohan Bernier, Rob Dillingham, Tejan Salon, Terrence Shannon, a lot of guys that you're just throwing darts. None of those guys project as all-stars, but maybe one of them hits. All of them were recent lottery picks, so we'll see. You'd have to offload Connaughton to a fifth team in this case because Milwaukee actually cannot reacquire him because they're trading for him. So maybe he goes to Brooklyn for a couple seconds. That could work. So you can see how complicated this gets very, very quickly. And there's a lot of moving parts, and pulling off these types of deals are nearly impossible, especially in season. And I'm sure if you're Minnesota, they probably would rather trade Randall than McDaniels or Gobert. But I have a feeling that if they really want to pull this off, the Jaden McDaniels probably has to be in the deal because I think he's worth the most on the open market, just given, like I said, his age, his malleability to fit on any roster, what he brings defensively, his contract, all of that. Randall is just kind of a weird player where he is not going to fit on every team, and Gobert's getting older. But then let's say they keep Randall. Him and Giannis is a clunky fit. Does Giannis play center for the team? Is Randall the 4? Giannis has never played center full time, even though I have mentioned that as a thing I think that teams should consider more that have Giannis. I think he actually could be a really good modern day starting center. Don't know if he wants to do that. And then, like I said, I mean, you've got Naz Reid. Are you playing Randall at the 3? You playing Naz Reid at the 3? Like the roster quickly becomes imbalanced. You still don't have a guard in the backcourt. Maybe you can get Sexton in this deal, for example, but is he the answer to the questions that they have in that backcourt? I'm not totally sure. He's a good spark plug scorer, but the defense is rough, and I'm not sure I trust him as like a decision maker, especially in a playoff setting. We haven't seen him there, so who knows? Maybe I could be wrong. But Minnesota, if they were to somehow get Giannis, it's kind of similar to the Golden State scenario where I'm like, Ant and Giannis would be quite the duo. And I think they would be a spectacular pairing just in terms of what they bring on both ends of the court, honestly. And definitely the best duo in the league. And I think that they would have a chance to win any series just because of those guys. But I don't see them like winning the championship this season because I think their roster would be so imbalanced. They'd have holes, and they would probably need at least one more transaction cycle to be able to, fit the pieces together to actually make it work. Maybe you then repurpose Randall for more of a defensive-minded 3, or you add that guard, whatever it might be. Maybe you bring in a center. But again, at that point, they're going to be really, really pressed for assets. And so I don't know if that next move's there. And so the problem with Golden State and Minnesota specifically is like, you make this move, that's your move. You don't have many other avenues to sort of fill the roster out other than just like minimum guys, for example. And I don't know if the construction is going to lend itself to a team that could actually win a championship. So I think the Wolves have much more upside if they make this deal, for example, but the downside, I think is a little lower just because of the holes that they would have. Do I think it's worth a swing for them? Probably, just because, look, if you can get Giannis and Ant on the same team, and they still would have some players left over. Dante DiVincenzo would still be here. Naz Reid would still be here. Randall would still be here. So, like, it's not like they're one of those teams where they got 2 good players and then a bunch of minimum guys. Like, they would still have other good players on the roster that they could move around. So I think it's worth a shot for Minnesota, but I would be shocked if this deal went down because, like I said, there are so many moving parts, and it's really difficult to make something like that happen. Similarly, for the Knicks, it would have to be something almost the same because the straight-up trade that works for the Knicks would be Giannis, Kuzma, and Portis for Cat, OG, and then every pick swap they have. They have one first, but I say first very loosely because it's not a real first that they can trade. It's Washington's first-round pick this year, which is top 8 protected, which consider me skeptical that is going to convey because they're probably going to be in the top 8, and that turns into second-round picks after this year. So it's essentially them just trading seconds. They can swap 3 or 4 different picks too, but I said this before. We're talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo. He's not going for pick swaps. That's not going to be good enough here. And I don't know why they'd want Cat and OG so they can be a 10 seed in the East every year. So it's probably going to be something similar where they'd have to repurpose some of their players, trade 2 of the 3 of OG, Cat, and Mikal to get other stuff. I think OG could maybe fetch somewhere from 2 to 3 firsts. I think Cat maybe 1 to 2, Mikal 1 to 2. I know Cat's the best player of the group, but his contract is massive. There's obviously been question marks about his flaws. And I just think with the salary number for him, he's not going to have some crazy market. I do think they can maybe get a pick or 2 for him, but probably just fillers other than that. I know Mikal just went for 5 picks, but to be honest, that was a bad trade. And if they didn't make that trade, Giannis probably would already be on the Knicks right now, for being totally honest. And so I don't think he's going to get that same kind of value. I think he could get maybe 2 first-round picks for the right team that they think could slot him in. And so, look, maybe you trade those guys, you get up to 4 first-round picks, maybe. But again, it's like it's a lot to give up from a player. I mean, this is already not a very deep team. If you trade Mikal and OG, and you've got Cat, Brunson, and Giannis, it's a talented trio, but they have zero wing depth. You're basically playing Landry Shamet and Josh Hart at the 3, and that's all you've got right there. So the defense on the perimeter becomes a lot more suspect, and it's already kind of suspect when you look at Brunson being on this team and being a pretty big liability on that end of the court. It's going to be a lot harder to hide him there. So I think defensively they are maybe worse off, even though it sounds insane getting a guy like Giannis into the fold there. But I do think Cat and Giannis is a dream fit offensively, and Brunson obviously, would fit in just fine with those two as well. But then let's say you keep one of the wings and trade Cat. Then your front court becomes really thin because you're heavily, heavily relying on Mitchell Robinson, who's been made of glass throughout his career. He's been weirdly healthy this year and towards the end of last year. But the second he goes down, it's basically you got to play Giannis at center, and then there's not a lot of other big bodies down there. And so the front court defense also could be suspect there. And so I just don't think that these, trade 2 of our core players for a bunch of picks and repurpose packages are realistic, especially in season. So I know all the reports were saying that the Knicks were his number 1 option and that he wanted to go there, and that, the Knicks have been wanting to add Giannis. But look, I think they messed up when they made some of these other moves. I said this when they made the Mikal Bridges trade, and I'll say it again now. In a vacuum, that trade was a terrible trade. It was a very bad trade value-wise. And I think Giannis would already be a Knick if they didn't make that deal. They probably could have shipped out OG and those 5 picks and 2 swaps and maybe throw McBride in there, and boom, Giannis is a Knick. And they still probably would have some assets to move some stuff around too, just to fill out the rest of the roster. But that trade totally handcuffed them because it was the move. That was the move. And I said at the time, they took their shot on him as the guy they were going to add. And it was just a little short-sighted to not think that maybe a Giannis or somebody else could become available down the road. And they just lost their opportunity because of that. And so I just don't view either of these teams as legitimate destinations. But next I want to talk about 4 teams that I think have the assets certainly to pull off a deal for Giannis, but are not really rumored to be in the mix. And I do think it would take some sort of, reactionary to something that happened during the rest of the season and how it plays out for them to really want to get into it. So again, teams that could pull it off, but I just don't know if the interest is really there. Starting off with San Antonio, we know they've got a bevy of assets. They could move up to 4 first-round picks plus 3 swaps. And they've got a ton of young, desirable prospects, talents, whatever you want to call them, particularly with Stephon Castle and Dylan Harper. They also have other desirable potential players between Devin Vassell, maybe De'Aaron Fox is in the mix. Carter Bryant was a first-round pick for them last year. They have guys that could be of interest for Milwaukee. And they certainly could just win the sweepstakes if they wanted to. If they just offered Harper and 4 of their firsts, then I think this thing would be done quickly, and the Spurs probably jump on that because I don't think they're going to get a better offer. And so the question comes down to, would San Antonio entertain this? 1, do they think that Giannis is a good fit for this group? And 2, do they want to give up those sort of assets? I think that they might be more willing to part with some of the draft capital down the line, but I think that they seem like they're a little stingy about some of their young guys between Castle and Harper. Me personally, if I was the Spurs, assuming I'm interested and I want to make a move for Giannis, I would be comfortable moving Stephon Castle because I think he's a very good player. He was deserving Rookie of the Year. He's had a really solid season this year. But his jump shot is a real concern for me. And if he can't get to league average shooting from 3, I suspect that he's going to be a liability for them offensively come playoff time. And I think that this year they will be in the playoffs. So we'll get the opportunity to see if that comes to fruition. But I just think that why would teams guard him? He's sub 30% for his career, and it's not like that's a one off. He was sub 30% in college as well. The guy has never, ever been able to shoot from outside. And so they probably would rather go the Giddy route, where let's see it play out, see if that's actually an issue, and then maybe reevaluate if we want to move the guy. But also, he does so much more for them as just sort of a playmaker, initiator. He's good on the defensive end. He's a great finisher inside. So don't get me wrong, he's still a good player. But I am a little bit more willing to move off of Castle than I think probably most people, but only if you're getting a guy like Giannis, which again, Giannis is an undisputed top 4 player in the league in his prime, a multi-time MVP. So we're talking about a true game-changing superstar here. Harper, on the other hand, I think I would definitely be more reluctant to move because he's so young, and I really think he has the potential to blossom into a legitimate all-star. He's shown flashes this year, and with Fox and Castle and a lot of the other guards in the fold here, he hasn't gotten the full opportunity. But I'd much rather have him kind of waiting in the wing to develop into one of the backcourt mates of the future next to Fox or whoever it ends up being down the road when Wemby's truly in his prime. But again, ultimately, I don't think the Spurs are going to be interested. They have the assets to do it. I would move Castle for him if I was going to go get Giannis. And if I'm the Bucks, I am not doing a deal that does not include Castle or Harper. If they refuse to move one of those two guys, then you know what? It's going to be picks and some meh players. And so I'm disinterested at that point. I think they can get a better offer elsewhere. The next team that could pull it off, but I'm skeptical would be interested, is the Houston Rockets. They could just move Fred VanVleet's contract, Reed Shepherd, Tari Eason, Dorian Finney-Smith, and they can trade up to 5 first-round picks and 3 swaps. So they can put together quite the compelling picks package. But the question from Milwaukee's standpoint is that enough from a player perspective? VanVleet is dead money. Eason is a very good player, but obviously limited offensively and more of a role guy. I think we know what he's going to be. The Dorian Finney-Smith contract looks pretty bad. I mean, it's the first year of 4 years. We know that teams are highly, highly prioritizing flexibility and cap space in recent years since the CBA has been in effect. And so I do not think that's a viable asset that a team would want in a trade like this. But that basically just leaves Reed Shepherd as sort of the main asset from the player perspective, which I really like Reed Shepherd. And I think he was worthy of a top 3 pick 2 years ago when the Rockets took him there. But it kind of just comes down to, does Milwaukee agree with that? Do they think he's good enough to be the centerpiece? Or does Houston really need to include Şengün or Amen Thompson to really get Milwaukee thinking about this? If I'm Houston, I don't know if I'd do that. I think people are a little too over the top bullish on Amen Thompson for my taste. Personally, I think he's a good player, but people talk about him like he's this surefire future superstar. Again, if that jump shot does not develop, I don't know if I see that out of him. And I think he's more of a Swiss Army knife, do a little bit of everything, two-way guy, which is highly valuable, but that's not how people talk about him. And then Şengün, I'm a big Şengün guy, and I just wouldn't move him. I think he's such a unique talent. I think there's a case to be made that he's already flirting with the top 20 player status this year. And so I'm just uninterested in that. But if I'm Milwaukee again, I probably am asking for one of those two guys. But I don't really like the fit for Houston regardless. Even if they were able to do it with keeping Thompson and Şengün, Giannis, Jabari Smith, KD, Amen Thompson, and then you trade away Reed Shepherd and VanVleet's contract, they already are short on guards. They will have 0 viable guards. I mean, Amen Thompson is the only ball handler you trust. After that, Aaron Holiday is playing a significant role for this team. You're basically playing KD at shooting guard, which I'm just personally not a fan of. And Jabari Smith's got to play the 3. I like him better at the 4. And this roster already skews way too big, not enough shooting, not enough ball handling, and the end of the game execution's been a little bit clunky. And I think the addition of Giannis into this group only amplifies that. Even though the talent is greater, he only is additive to what they would be wanting to do defensively. But ultimately, I just don't – I don't love the fit. I've never viewed Houston as a really good spot for Giannis because of that. especially with Van Vliet being out to start this season, especially having to give up Reed Shepherd and whatever deal they would have to make. And so, look, would they be more talented? It would be a very strange team, maybe the biggest team we've ever seen, like I mentioned. And they would have more offensive creation, but I just think the spacing would be off. There's not enough shooting. So I wouldn't do it if I were Houston. If I was going to use all those assets, I'd rather allocate them for somebody who's a little bit more of a cleaner fit, but preferably a guard. Then the next team, moving to the Hawks, who probably are not as interested right now, but for a very different reason than the Spurs and the Rockets, for example. Those teams probably like where they're at. They want to see what this season brings and how far they can get with the current groups before maybe adding more pieces. Versus Atlanta, they probably want to see how the season plays out as well, but it's more about their draft pick and where they end up in the lottery. Because as we've mentioned, they have the ability to have the better between New Orleans pick and Milwaukee's pick. So there's a really good chance that they end up with the top 4 pick because Milwaukee's sliding down the standings, especially if they trade Giannis. And then New Orleans has been one of the worst teams all season long. So they're going to have combined really good odds to get into that top 3 or 4. The other thing here is that they obviously already traded Trae Young. So even if they were to add Giannis, I don't know if from a guard perspective, they're in a spot to be able to, really contend. But the other point is that, again, he's out 4 to 6 weeks. So if they were to add him at the deadline, they are currently a couple games below 500 and in the 10 seed. So there's no guarantee they'd even make the playoffs just with him out, especially if they're having to give up valuable players to get him. And so they make way more sense as an offseason team. But again, I think they really want to see where this pick falls. If it's a top 2 pick, then I think they certainly want to keep that pick. And there's really no reason why they wouldn't just roll with Darren Peterson alongside Jalen Johnson and Dyson Daniels and Reese Shea, et cetera. I think they're more likely to make more of a margin move to flip Reese Shea and 1 or 2 of these picks for a better long-term fit at the forward position. Or maybe they let Porzingis walk and upgrade the center spot, et cetera. But I don't think that it makes sense for them to trade for Giannis until they kind of see how that plays out. But they certainly have the assets to do it. I think Jalen Johnson's obviously completely off the table. If I were them, I'd probably make that Pelicans/Bucks pick off the table too until we see where it's at. If it ends up 5 or 6, maybe I'm more willing to part with that. But they've got Porzingis' expiring contract. Reese Shea is probably movable at this point. Kennard's expiring contract, and they can trade up to 4 first-round picks as well as 3 swaps. And with those picks, too, it's not just any old picks. They're particularly valuable to Milwaukee because they own 2 potential Bucks picks. Obviously, one of them this season, and then in 2027, they own the least favorable between theirs and the Pelicans, which, of course, you'd rather have the more favorable if you're going to trade for that pick as Milwaukee. But the point is, they could regain some of their control of their own draft, which is obviously very, very valuable for a team that's probably going to be entering a rebuild after this inevitable move that they make of Giannis. And so the Hawks are a logical partner because of that and the assets and the fact that, they've got some really good, young, exciting talent. But again, from a fit perspective, I don't love the Jalen Johnson Giannis fit. It's a little duplicative offensively. They kind of need to be playing the same position. They don't really have the guard play. So ultimately, after they traded Trae Young, I thought this just going out and getting Giannis made less sense. I can't totally rule them out if it comes to the offseason just because they do have the assets. And hey, let's say they can add a guard in another way. Then suddenly they're a really formidable threat in the Eastern Conference. But again, I think that they're more likely to just kind of go the young route after dealing Trae Young earlier this season. And then the last team in this group, which this one's been floated by some people, but I think everybody knows it's very, very unlikely, is the Thunder, because they do have a lot of picks, to say the least. I believe they can trade up to 10 first-round picks in 3 swaps. They've got plenty of young talent. AJ Mitchell has burst onto the scene this year. He could be a desirable asset. They could trade Dort and Hartenstein's salaries. They've also got other pieces between Kason Wallace, Isaiah Joe, Aaron Wiggins. Like, they've got guys that could be of interest, and they obviously have the picks to do so. If I'm the Thunder, J-Dub and Chet are just complete non-starters. If I'm making this move, it's to add to the core around those 2 and SGA. And if I'm the Bucks, if I'm not getting one of those guys, maybe It's just more leverage to get more picks here. But again, I do not think the Thunder, especially midseason, would do this in the offseason. I still would be skeptical. I mean, we we shall see, just because, again, what if they lose second round? It gets a lot harder to stay complacent and just keep, trusting what the team has when you look more vulnerable come playoff time. So we'll see how it plays out for them. If I was OKC, I would just do this. Like, maybe wait till the offseason, because I get the whole not wanting to shake it up midseason. But if it gets to that point, I would do it. You have all these picks, and we've seen this in the past where these teams hoard picks, and then if you don't end up moving them at some point, you can't have too many picks. You can't just pick 3 guys in the draft every single year. You don't have enough roster spots. Not to mention that they're going to have to move off some of these guys because they're not going to be able to pay everybody. They already paid J-Dub. They already paid Chet. They obviously paid SGA. They're probably not going to be able to pay Kason Wallace and re-sign Dort and bring back Hartenstein and pay AJ Mitchell. So, like, they're going to have tough decisions to make. So why not consolidate some of those pieces now, move off them while the value's high, while they're cheap, and go get Giannis? And I'm just saying, like, you put Giannis next to Chet in that front court alongside J-Dub, SGA, whoever's in that fit spot, they're going to still have plenty of depth. Like, to me, this is the kind of all-in move worth making, just because I know you'd have to give up a lot, but they have so many assets. You don't have to trade all 10 of those picks. Like, you could trade 6 of them, and you'd still have the normal amount of firsts over the next few years, and you'd still have moves to make. And so I understand that what's gotten them to this point is Presti's patience and being selective in which moves he makes to go all in on, and mostly just standing pat year to year and letting the team develop. But at a certain point, like, if they do lose in the second round this season or something goes awry in the playoffs, I personally would strongly consider it. But I think they're a pretty big long shot, just because I don't foresee it happening. I just think that's not how Presti typically operates. But you never know. Traded for Paul George. He's made big splashes in the past, so I can't totally rule it out. But I really think it would take something sort of catastrophic in the postseason to even get that ball rolling in motion. Next, we have the group of 2 teams that I think are more off-season trades for Giannis. So I do think that there's a chance that these teams could get in the mix, but I think just logistically it makes more sense to do it in the offseason just because of all the moving parts. So the first team here is the Orlando Magic, who are having a bit of a up and down year, to say the very least. The fit between some of their guys has not been super clean. Offensively continues to be clunky. They don't have enough shooting, etc., which, of course, you're saying, okay, well, then why would they add Giannis, who obviously cannot shoot? But he would just raise their floor from what they have. But the reason this is interesting in the offseason is because Paolo Banchero becomes trade eligible after his extension kicks in, and the poison pill contract is no longer an issue. And salary matching becomes very, very easy all of a sudden. And I know that Orlando does not have a lot of picks to trade. They only have 1 pick to trade this offseason, which is a 2032 pick. So it's very far out. They could do up to 4 swaps. So from Milwaukee's perspective, if you want to draft Hall, this is not the team. However, Paolo Banchero may be the best young, not even all-star potential player, because we've seen him make an all-star team, but all-NBA level potential for a guy who's 22, 23 years old, who's performed in the postseason, who could be your franchise guy, who just checks all the boxes for the type of talent you want to get back for a guy like Giannis. And you could get him plus Anthony Black, plus Jett Howard, plus that first round pick. So definitely more of a unique package, but I do think it's interesting because from Orlando's perspective, Paolo's not having a very good year. He's one of the worst jump shooters in the NBA, especially at his volume, maybe the worst at his volume. And the offense, just even with the addition of Bane, the Franz Paolo fit has been a question for years now. I think it's generally overstated. They've been injured this year, but there's no denying that it's just been a little off this season across the board for the team. And so I'm just saying, you put Giannis in that 4 spot next to Franz, next to Bane, next to Suggs. First of all, they would be absolutely tremendous defensively, which are already a good defensive team, but Giannis is a huge upgrade there over Paolo. And you get rid of some of those bad isolation, mid-range fadeaway shots that Paolo's taking and insert Giannis, who's like the most efficient 30-point scorer in NBA history, just from field goal percentage over the past few years, shooting 60+%. I mean, the shot profile is going to look different, but it's going to be a lot more efficient of an offense. And I do think that it's going to provide more spacing for Bane and Franz and Suggs because he's going to be doing all of his work down low, and they're going to have to help off those guys. So more open shots for those guys. So to me, if Orlando were to make this deal, it's obviously risky because Giannis is older. He's got the injury history. You're exhausting all of your assets, and you're just willingly moving off Paolo Banchero, which would be tough, in my opinion. But this might be the kind of deal where it would be worth it. Again, I don't know if they would do it, but this puts you in prime position to be one of the top tier contenders in the East. Like if you put Giannis in that Paolo spot this season, Orlando's probably my pick for the finals because I already think they have a ton of talent, and obviously the shooting and spacing could still be a bit of an issue, but Giannis is a tremendous upgrade over Paolo, at least as Paolo is currently constructed. And I think, again, it's going to open up the floor for Bane. It's going to open up the floor for Suggs. They'd be so good defensively. They still would have some, viable pieces off the bench, and Noah Penda, Tinda Silva, Ugo Batadze, Mo Wagner, Jace Richardson. So it puts them right in the mix, with the Celtics getting Tatum back next year, with the Knicks or Cavs or whatever they look like next year, with the Pacers getting Halliburton back. Like, to me, they're firmly in that group, in that top tier, above the Pistons if they don't add anybody, in my opinion. And so it's worth thinking about for the Magic. I do think trading Paolo could come back to bite them. If Giannis continues to have the kind of injuries that he's had, then we might look back and it might be a big mistake because Paolo could develop into a legitimate All-NBA player and they would lose maybe a decade of play from him. But again, it's like you got to take risks sometimes if you want to get over that hump. And I do think it would be a risk at least worth considering. And then from Milwaukee's perspective, like I mentioned, he's the best young player that they could get. If you throw in Anthony Black, he's looked really, really good this year. Those two guys alone is such a good player package that you can maybe live with the light picks package. And look, Black, Rollins, Paolo, Turner, like that's not that bad of a team. Like they're not going to bottom out with that group. They're still maybe 1 to 2 pieces away from playoff contention. But if they aren't interested in some full hard reset rebuild, which would make sense because they don't own most of their picks, this might be the kind of deal that they would want to go with. And then the second offseason team that I think makes sense is the Cleveland Cavaliers. This is another one of those ones that's a little difficult, but it's a little easier now than it was now that they got off the DeAndre Hunter contract. But it probably has to be at least a 3-team trade. I think in Cleveland's mind, they'd like to have Garland and Allen be the centerpieces of this. And it could be pretty doable if they can find a team to take Allen. I think from Milwaukee's perspective, you'd probably be good getting Garland. He's only 26 and obviously has shown a ton of promise. He's made multiple all-star teams to this point in his career, and he's been just a really, really good player when he's been on the court, particularly offensively and particularly in the regular season. A true floor general that can, get his shot, pick his spots, get others involved. So to me, he's a great player centerpiece for a Giannis deal. But the question comes with the picks because they only have 1 tradable first right now, but they have 2 tradable in the offseason. So if you assume it's 2 picks plus Garland and then whatever you can get for Allen, I mentioned Gobert to Charlotte earlier as potential 3rd team. What if you put Jared Allen on Charlotte as their center of the future to go along with that core and then get back fillers and expiring contracts with maybe 2 first-round picks? Suddenly you've got 4 firsts plus some swaps plus Garland. Like, to me, that's a really, really nice package if you're in Milwaukee, and one of the better ones that we've talked about to this point. And then from Cleveland's perspective, you're maybe the favorite in the East at this point. If you can keep Mobley, keep Mitchell, and Giannis, that's the best trio in the Eastern Conference, probably by a good chunk. And then you still have guys like Max Strus. You still have Jalen Tyson, who's had a really, really good second season this year and sort of emerged and made DeAndre Hunter expendable. They would still have Schroeder next year. They have a lot of guys that are expiring between Keon Ellis, Sam Merrill, Dean Wade, Larry Nance, but you have to assume they bring some of those guys back. They just traded for Ellis. He'll be your restricted free agent, so I think they probably want to bring him back. But the bench would still potentially be viable depending on how many of those guys they're able to bring back. And that starting lineup is, one of the best in the Eastern Conference, and it makes Cleveland a really, really big threat. And I think Mobley and Giannis would be a really good fit together because I think Mobley has started to space the floor a little bit more to the point where he doesn't have to be camped in the paint. And we know that Giannis is best when he's operating next to centers that can live a little bit more on the perimeter. Not to mention defensively, those two would be just absolutely unbelievable as a duo in the front court there. And I think they'd probably be one of the best defensive teams in the league. To me, if you're Cleveland and you lose second round again, something like that, this is something you absolutely have to consider. The Garland and Mitchell fit and then the Mobley and Allen fit have been talked about for a long time now. And I do think whether it's Giannis or somebody else, I think one of those guys will get moved in the offseason if they flame out again in the postseason, which probably is more likely than not, just given the season that they've had to this point. And so Giannis becomes the best option for them. And again, they're in the second apron right now, but in the offseason, it's a lot easier for them to get under. They could salary dump Lonzo to another team, add some swaps or second round picks or whatever it might be there. Whether Charlotte can absorb some of that, you get a third team involved. But again, that stuff's a lot easier in the offseason because teams have cap space. And so that would make them able to aggregate salaries, which is how they're able to send out Garland and Allen. But again, I don't know how desperate Cleveland will be in the offseason. But again, this is a team that I think it is absolutely worth a shot to do something like this. And that move to get closer to under the second apron with Hunter going to Sacramento certainly makes you think a little bit of maybe they are loading up for sort of a bigger move, whether that's at the deadline or in the offseason. And then there's one last team that I want to talk about, and this is my absolute favorite Giannis trade team, and it is the Portland Trailblazers. We've seen a lot of smoke about how they could potentially be a third team to facilitate a Knicks deal or whoever else. There were rumors that they like Mikal Bridges a lot, that Drew Holiday would be a desirable teammate next to Giannis, and that maybe he could be involved in that deal. I'm not buying any of that because, to be honest with you, I don't know if Mikal Bridges has a lot more value than Drew Holiday anyway. Certainly not enough to add 2 to 3 first-round picks in there. And so I never bought that as something that was legitimate to help New York get Giannis or anything like that. But again, if you're Portland, why not cut out the middleman? You can just go ahead and get him yourself. I mean, they have the pieces to do it. They could send out Jeremy Grant's salary plus Scoot Henderson, who was the number 3 pick just a couple of years ago and showed a lot of promise down the second half of last season. Obviously has not played a game this year, but still super young and was, again, a very highly regarded prospect not that long ago. Could throw in a guy like Jan Hansen or something like that. Maybe you have to put in a Shaden Sharp or a Tumani Kamara or a Donovan Clingan. I think if you're Portland, you'd prefer to keep all 3 of those guys. If you're Milwaukee, probably the sticking point is having at least one of them in there. But the thing for Portland is they could afford to put one of them in there and still actually be okay. And of course, Sharp can't really get traded till the offseason because he's another one of those poison pill guys. But aside from the players, the Blazers can move up to 4 first-round picks and 3 swaps. And not just any picks. They own Milwaukee's draft rights in 2028, 2029, and 2030. So again, as I mentioned with Atlanta, those picks are particularly valuable to Milwaukee. So if they could get those 3 picks, which I know they're consecutive years, so it sounds like they can't, but they actually can because Portland has another 29 pick aside from just Milwaukee. So they could actually move all 3 of those picks in theory. And so if they could get all 3 of those picks or even just 2 of them, they can basically feel comfortable going through a rebuild because they know they have their picks in the future that they can rely on to get them a high pick in the lottery. And they're getting pretty good players back too. I mean, if you could get Scoot Henderson plus Shaden Sharp or Scoot Henderson plus Tumani Kamara, if you're Milwaukee, that's 2 really good, young, promising players on top of what's probably the best pick package you're going to get. So it's certainly worth entertaining if you're Milwaukee. And I actually think this offer is one of the better ones. And especially if they're willing to throw all their picks in there, plus 2 of those guys, and even maybe a third to get over the finish line. Like, I think Portland really has the power to top any offer for Giannis. And what makes this funny is then he'd be reunited with both Dame and Drew, who were traded for each other, and both obviously played with Giannis in Milwaukee. But from Portland's perspective, this lineup starts to look really good really quickly because going into next year, Obviously, we don't know exactly what Dame is going to look like. If he's 80% of what he was, he'll still be a really good player on the offensive end. Maybe not all-star caliber, but still really solid. Obviously, he struggles defensively, so I would expect it might only get a little bit worse there. But at the very least, we know he's going to be able to put up points and be a floor spacer. So him next to Drew Holiday, who's the best backcourt mate Dame has had from a defensive standpoint, so should be able to cover up a little bit of what Dame struggles with on that end. You still have Denny Avdia, who I talked about earlier, is a very deserving all-star player this year, could even flirt with All-NBA. And I'd love to see him in a role where he doesn't have to do so much, because I think he'd be more efficient and it would even maximize what he can bring, particularly as a two-way guy. You throw Giannis in there, and then if they're able to keep Klingin, like that's a really, really good five. And they still have options off the bench. You know, if they're able to keep Sharp or keep Kamara or maybe even keep both. But even if they just keep one of those guys, that top six is insanely good. Like you could play small ball with Giannis at the five, put Kamara in there with Denny and Drew, and like that's a really, really good defensive team. But then they've also got shooting and spacing with Drew and Dame and Denny, who's got, you know, an elevated level of shot creation and playmaking now next to Giannis. And then Klingon's even starting to space the floor a little bit now. And so to me, this makes Portland right in the thick of things. Like, are they on OKC's level? I don't know. I think we'd have to see like what Dame looks like and how the team meshes and how they fill out the rest of the bench. But to me, they're right up there with the Houstons of the world and the Lakers of the world and the Wolves of the world immediately. And they might even be better than those teams. And so if you're Portland, like, why'd you trade for Drew? Why'd you sign Dame if you didn't kind of want to win now anyway? And so if I were them, I would basically not trade those Milwaukee picks almost in any circumstance, unless it was for something like this. Like if you can get, again, a top 4 undisputed player in the game of basketball to round out this team and take pressure off Denny and make Dame more of a luxury and have an elite potential defensively to go along with the firepower they now have on offense, like it's a good mix of old guys and young guys between Kamara, Klingon, and Sharp, you know, whichever ones they're able to keep of that, plus Denny, who's still on the younger side, plus Drew, Dame, and Giannis. So it's a good mix where if some of the guys start to age a little bit, some of the other guys can start to take on more of a role. And so I don't know. I would love this for Portland. I think it would be incredibly interesting for them moving forward. They'd have a couple year window here before Dame and Drew start to decline a ton. And again, you're not losing your own draft capital that much. So even if it doesn't work out, sure, those Milwaukee picks would have been nice to have, but it's not like you've completely exhausted your assets. And if 3 years from now, Dame's out of the league, Drew's washed, and Giannis is having injury stuff, it's like they're still going to have some of their own picks. So it's not the end of the world either. So it's a little bit of a lower risk move just because the picks they have from Milwaukee are more luxury than necessity for them. And then from Milwaukee's perspective, like I mentioned, if you can get 3 extra years of your own picks controlled in the draft on top of good young players, I feel like that's the exact kind of package they're looking for. So to me, this makes maybe the most sense of any partner, but just between the two of them. And if you're Milwaukee, you get them out of the Eastern Conference too. And look, maybe Giannis doesn't want to go to Portland, but I will say with the relationship with Dame and Drew, on top of the fact that he had no problem being in a cold weather, small market like Milwaukee, if any superstar is going to be open to going to Portland, it would make sense that it would be Giannis. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk about a couple small trades that went down. Starting with the Kings, Bulls, and Cavs trade where DeAndre Hunter went to Sacramento, Keon Ellis and Dennis Schroeder went to Cleveland, and Dario Saric and 2 second-round picks went to Chicago. On the Cleveland side of this, I think this deal makes sense for them because, one, it is financial relief, which I talked about it earlier. They're up against that second apron. And DeAndre Hunter just hasn't been good for them this year. He's been, throughout his career, been more of a theoretical player, this 3-and-D guy who, if you watch the games and look under the hood, he doesn't actually play that much defense. And he did shoot well for Cleveland last year. But this year, only 30.8% from 3. For his career, he's 36.5, so right around average. So he doesn't provide much else offensively. He's got good size and length, but again, doesn't use it very often in a way that's productive on the defensive end of the court. And so I don't think they're losing much with Hunter. The only thing I will say is that they don't have a ton of size on the wing now. they're going to be really reliant on Jalen Tyson to kind of be that bigger forward, even though he's not particularly big, but he has been really, really good this year. So I think they probably don't make this deal without the assurance that he's like a legitimate rotation player like he's been this year. Max Strus is supposed to come back soon as well. But outside of those guys, Dean Wade can play a little bit small forward, but I think he's better at the 4. And then we got a lot of small guards now between Garland, Mitchell, Ellis, Schroeder, Merrill, Lonzo. Not that Lonzo's a small guard, but he's obviously a guard. And so I don't know how the minutes are going to be allocated there, but Garland being out makes this deal make a little bit more sense because now you don't necessarily have to rush him back, and then Schroeder can kind of take over a lot of those ball handling point guard minutes. And then look, Keon Ellis to me, he's a great ad. I don't really know why Sacramento was so insistent on not bringing him back and really not playing him either. He's a really, really good defensive player. He's hit relatively consistently from outside. He's obviously limited offensively, but you're not asking him to do too much on that end. So from Cleveland's perspective, I think this is good value, especially when you take into account that they were able to get off the Hunter contract, which had multiple years after this season and was a higher salary mark. They're getting closer to that second apron so they can actually aggregate salaries. If they were to move Lonzo Ball, for example, to a team and take no assets back, or at least a smaller amount of cash, then they would be able to get under that second apron. So this could be the move before the move before the move, in which they could make a larger move. Again, whether that's Giannis, different discussion, probably not. But I'm sure they might want to do something before the deadline just because they have been playing a little bit better recently. But I still do have concerns because it seems like their whole team is built on 2 bigs with a bunch of guards, not a lot of wings with size. And I do worry about them defensively in the postseason because we've seen Garland be a liability. They don't really have a reliable point of attack defender. I mean, maybe it's Jalen Tyson, but we haven't seen that on a larger scale. It's a smaller track record for him, and he's been, fine defensively, but I think he's been better offensively for them. And then they've got the 2 bigs, which has been a little clunky in the postseason as is. So we'll see. I think they're probably not done, so I won't fully judge this for them. But overall, I think in a vacuum, it's a good deal value-wise. But obviously, I do think there still is some holes there on the wing outside of Jalen Tyson. On the Kings side of this, I don't really understand this deal for them just because what is DeAndre Hunter providing them? He's basically a worse discount Keegan Murray of sorts, 2 guys that in theory are these 3-and-D guys, kind of limited offensively, but their defense isn't as good as probably advertised. Their shooting's not as good as probably advertised. And, Hunter kind of is what he is at this point. And they're a team that should be selling off guys, not adding veterans that are quote unquote win now moves because they have the worst record in the NBA right now. Like they should not be trying to add players, especially not trying to move off guys like Keon Ellis, who are younger and have control. I mean, I know he's going to be a free agent after the year, but he'll be restricted. So they would have the rights to be able to re-sign him if they wanted to. And so I just would have preferred they used Keon Ellis as sort of a different asset. I get in theory, maybe they're using him as an asset to get off the Schroeder deal, which didn't really make much sense for them in the offseason anyway, especially when you consider they were going to sign Russell Westbrook. So I won't get into all of that. Most things the Kings do confuse me, and I would normally do the opposite of what they've been doing. So I guess you could say a good thing they got off the Schroeder deal because it was kind of an overpay and it's multi-year. But again, it's like adding that salary. They added more money. They're closer to an apron now. And it's like this team has no business being like a high salary team. And they should be selling Levine off. They should be selling DeRozan off. They should be selling Sabonis off. And I don't know if there's market for that guy. But at the very least, they do have their pick this year. So maybe they get lucky and are able to, get the future of the franchise in this draft. But I don't know. I don't understand a lot of what they've done over the last few years. And this trade is another one where I don't know. I just don't I don't see why you're acquiring DeAndre Hunter outside of just salary dumping Schroeder, but they both have big salaries for the level of player they are. And so it's kind of a moot point because they actually added money in this scenario. On the Bulls side, they finally did something kind of smart, which they normally don't do. They're normally the type that's involved on the other side of these kind of deals where they're having to give up picks to get off guys. But, taking Sharichan for 2 seconds, sure, that's a win. I mean, he's going to be free agent at the end of the year. He's not an NBA rotation player at this point in his career. So cool. Good job, Chicago. You finally did something. Then Moving to the other deal that went down, we had Duop Reith and 2 second-round picks going to Atlanta for Vit Krejci. And a little confused by this deal for Atlanta. I guess in theory you could argue that he's a little redundant with Luke Kennard and Corey Kispert, and now that Kispert's in the fold, there's just not a ton of minutes to go around as that kind of roaming shooter type on the wing. But Kennard's a free agent at the end of the year. I probably would have rather sold him off as an expiring salary, which could be valuable to teams. And Vit Krejci is controllable at a really cheap number for the next few years, and he's had a really good season for them. He's shooting 42% from three, and he's a 41% shooter for his career. And that's for a guy who is 6'8". He can handle the ball a little bit. He's got a career high in volume and points this season. Like, Krejci's been really solid for Atlanta. And so just to move him to then get Duop Reith, and I believe he's getting bought out, so it's essentially just a dump for the 2 picks. I don't know. If I was Atlanta, those 2 picks, second-round picks don't do a ton for me. I feel like I would have rather just kept Krejci, especially with how cheap he is. It's not like Atlanta's in any sort of financial crunch here. But for Portland, I love this just because, I mean, you get one, they desperately needed shooting, and 2, it's just another really, really cheap one because they're paying him not very much, cheap 2 because it didn't cost them much to get him. Guy that can play in their rotation, and with all the injuries they've had this year, they are kind of hurting for rotation players. And so it's a good ad for them. Again, they go get Giannis. This is the exact kind of player they would want around him coming off the bench as a 7th, 8th, 9th man potentially. And so I think it's just a good value get for Portland. And then again, from Atlanta's side, I don't totally get it. It could be one of those, precursor moves. Maybe they wanted to clear space, clear a roster spot, etc. But to me, I would have rather moved off someone like a Keaton Wallace or something like that if I was going to have to move off a guy. And they've got tradable expiring contracts. Porzingis is expiring at $30+ million. McCollum is expiring at $30+ million. I mentioned Kennard is making 11, 12 million. He's expiring. So those guys are all movable at those numbers. People want those kind of deals as expiring contracts going into the deadline. So they'd have real value as not just as the player, but just as an asset. So to move someone so cheap as Krejci, I don't know. I like Krejci as a player, and he's not perfect, obviously, but if he's your 9th guy making $2 million a year, that's the kind of guy everybody would want on their team, shooting 42% from 3. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Sean Jones NBA Show. Thank you so much for listening. Trade deadline is this week, so I certainly will have another episode coming up after that passes to talk about all the deals that go down and potentially deals that do not go down. Again, I do not anticipate Giannis getting traded. I think it's probably going to happen in the offseason for a number of reasons that I laid out. And so it could be rather uneventful if he's not moved. I don't necessarily think for sure that guys like John Morant are going to get moved or anything like that either. So it could be more fringe players like the Kobe Whites of the world, whatever. But regardless of what goes down, I'll be here to cover it. So excited to talk through those with you guys. So with that being said, thanks for listening, and I will chat with you soon.